play right, cause they can't miss. All about the game, that's a cold switch. Serving up the truth, call it ruthless. Tune in and get your fix from Blake and Vish Sports.
I mean, you and I have talked about the Niners a lot this offseason. Cornerback depth has always been a point of concern that we have brought up and we have talked about as in saying, like, hey, like, this is really their biggest Achilles heel. We're not sure what they're going to do. We felt like Verrett was a good starter, and then, you know, Mosley would be fine, and then Lenoir kind of emerged this offseason. But now Verrett, he's out for the season. He tore his ACL. Where do you think the Niners go from here? How do you think this affects them? And looking at the division and seeing how well those other teams played, how do you think this affects them overall within there?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say first and foremost, me and you have kind of been on this the whole offseason. We are saying we know Jason Verrett's there, but he has a long injury history. Now, we've said before, like, what does it even mean to be injury prone? Can you predict injuries? All of that. But all you and I were saying is that, yes, Jason Verrett, when healthy, he looks like a top 10 corner. He's fantastic. You throw him out there, plug and play, no worries. But availability is the best availability, and it's an issue that he can't be out there. So we were a little, I guess the term would be cautiously optimistic about him this year. And worst case scenario, week 1, he's down for the season. And then the secondary just starts looking a little more shaky. I know they got Ambry Thomas. Lenoir has apparently been really good in camp and the preseason and all that, but I am still worried about what are they going to do when DK Metcalf, DeAndre Hopkins, and those type of guys, you're playing those type of guys. But I think even more so than the secondary, what I think is going to put the most pressures on now is the defensive line to generate pressure as quickly and as best as you possibly can from all sides. Because the only really way to alleviate this is you're not getting a free agent cornerback that you can plug in. You're probably not going to be able to trade for anyone because cornerback's a very premium position. So at this point, it's really, I think, a lot of stress is on the defensive line and the DC to create pressure and give the secondary time to actually cover for longer, because as of right now, losing someone as good as Verrett is just tough. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I think you nailed it on the head. Like, we kept talking about this cornerback depth issue, and I think our biggest thing wasn't that, there was, like, for example, I was talking about this with Grant earlier. There's 64 starting corners in the NFL that start for 32 teams. I don't think all 32 teams have 2 starting caliber corners.
Definitely
There are
not.
very few teams. I mean, you have teams like Denver, teams like Miami that have 3 or 4 guys that could start, but like the reason corner allocation, the roster allocation, and in terms of into corners, especially early in drafts, is so important is because it's so difficult to find starting corners. For example, the Niners just signed both Josh Norman and Dre Kirkpatrick. I don't think neither of those guys are going to make a massive impact in terms of being able to start for the Niners and contribute. I think they're just depth pieces. But I also look at, like, for example, Ambry Thomas, he does not look ready to play this year. I think he might be good maybe in the future. I don't want to write him off. We're 6 months into his NFL career, but he doesn't look like this year he can handle NFL wide receivers. So he needs to sit out. Right. So now you have basically Lenoir and Mosley. And I like Lenoir and Mosley as starters on the other side of Verrett, who's a top 10 to 12 corner in the NFL. Starting them next to each other, I think the best thing to talk about is, like you said, there's just more pressure on this defensive line. And it's going to be more pressure specifically on D Ford and Nick Bosa, because D Ford and Nick Bosa are really the 2 special guys on this defensive line. And Ford played very little, very sparingly yesterday, but when he played, he stood out. D Ford looked like D Ford. I mean, the pick 6 with Dre Greenlaw, that's created by D Ford and his ability to just take the right tackle and bull rush him all the way back into Jared Goff. And then, of course, Goff threw a terrible ball. I don't know where he was throwing it. And it's an easy pick 6 for Greenlaw. So I think that's where the pressure, they're going to have to really, really change games. I think this corner depth is an issue, especially when you look at Verrett's impact later in the season. They beat Arizona the second time last year because they got really physical with DeAndre Hopkins. And you can press DeAndre Hopkins if you have Jason Verrett. I would be scared to press DeAndre Hopkins if I had Emmanuel Mosley and Diamador Lenoir trying to get physical with him. And we saw that the Niners didn't press DeAndre Hopkins when they started Sherman and Mosley week 1, and DeAndre Hopkins, I think, had like 12 catches for 120 yards and 2 touchdowns against them. So Jason Verrett's obviously a massive loss for the 49ers. They definitely need to – the only way they're going to be able to solve this issue and, move on further, it's not going to be by getting better corners. They have to make do with what they have and hope those guys play well. And Lenore played a good game. Granted, it was against a very poor receiving core with Tyrell Williams and Amon St. Brown for the Lions. I think that you're going to have to see a better pass rush. I think this pass rush is just going to have to dominate games. And if this pass rush dominate games, they have 2 good safeties who both are starting. They have good linebackers led by Fred Warner, the best in the NFL. It should be fine, more or less, to be able to cover up, because they're not going to be able to sign a corner like Kirkpatrick Norman. Those guys aren't going to come in and do anything, and they're not going to. And maybe they can trade for one. Maybe Stephon Gilmore, week 7, week 8, once he's off PUP, you go get him. I don't know with what resources they can go get him, but really that's where the Niners are at. I think that's the reality. There's nothing else to say, but you just have to move on and hope that your pass rush and your safeties and all of them can compensate.
And I know, or at least seeing this from the Niners Twitter, that Shanahan himself said, like, cornerback depth is just like something that's really huge for us and something that's going to be a big part of our season, and we really do need it. But it seems like it was kind of a, one foot in the door, 1 foot out in their just willingness to address it this year, just in general. I mean, yes, they took in Ambry Thomas and Lenore, but if that's your debatably weakest position, taking Banks, a guard, that was also a position I need, but a running back, like trading up for Trey Sermon when you need a cornerback so desperately, it makes you scratch your head. And maybe even taking more guys later. All I know is it was debatably just not addressed as much as it should have, knowing that if this one guy goes down, your cornerback duos are just not where it needs to be, considering, how many good receivers are in the NFL. Because I think that's the thing too, right? Like you've mentioned, there's 64 starting corners. There's also 64 starting receivers, and there's a lot of guys that play in the slot too, but there's a lot more better receivers than there are corners by just a considerable amount.
Yeah. I think just about every team has 2 good receivers. I think 12 teams have 2 good corners.
Yeah.
I could name 15 teams that have 3 good receivers. So I'm totally with you. And I think that's where you wish, even the Banks, we've talked about this ad nauseum. Good corners go in the top 50 picks of the draft. Look at the best ones. Marlon Humphrey, he's playing right now. He was the 15th overall pick in the draft. Jair Alexander was the 18th pick in the draft. Stephon Gilmore, 10th pick in the draft to Buffalo. Jalen Ramsey was the 5th pick in the draft. Go through the history. Besides Richard Sherman, which elite corner do you remember that was not a highly touted first-round pick? Joe Hayden was picked 7th. Patrick Peterson was picked 5th. Darrelle Revis was picked 12th. All these guys get picked very highly because it's really difficult to find corners. You have to be a really elite athlete to play corner. And even if you draft a corner in the top 40, 50 picks because he is that elite athlete, there's a good chance he doesn't live up. Look at the Packers. They draft a corner every other year high. And they're 2 for 4. They're 2 for 4 in their last. We'll see on Eric Stokes, but they're technically, I would say, 2 for 4. Josh Jackson didn't work out, but I like more or less Quentin Rollins and Demarius Randall didn't work out, but more or less, I think I was more talking Rollins, Jackson, King, and Jair. I think King even being able to start for them for this long and be fine on the other side, be just average, is a hit pick because it's so difficult to get corners. You wish King was a star. You picked him, 29th, 28th, but the reality of the situation is it's so hard to play corner that if King is an average starter, that's fine. So that to me is the most important thing. It's unfortunate for the that it went down this way. The Niners have not addressed corner at any point with a high pick in the draft, so we knew that this situation would be there, and we knew the depth was shaky to begin with. And so really the best thing for them is that they compensate with great pass rush great safety play, great linebacker play, and they compensate around it because Mosley and Lenore can be fine, but they need abundance of help.
They need good safeties, they need good linebackers, and they need a fantastic pass rush. And I guess the good thing is the linebackers, you can count on those. Safeties, more or less, you can also count on those as well, as long as, they're healing from their own injuries. And then the D-line, which last year was tough because Bosa was out, so that really put a stamp in things. But, I mean, I guess I think end of the day for me is the D-line's going to have to just create pressure a lot. And
It's going to have to dominate.
DeMeco Ryan's going to have some creative and well-timed blitzes to actually, just give them help because man-on-man, DeAndre Hopkins versus Lenore or Ambry Thomas, that is a tough ask at the end of the day.
I think Jamal, more or less, our point is that you can't. That's why you can't address this position now. Honestly, it's frankly very difficult to address this position in off seasons too. Very few times do a Stephon Gilmore hit the open market and you can go sign him for big money. Most of the time, you have to sign a guy like Tremaine Johnson, who's a clear tier below the elite corners, and you go sign him for elite corner money because there's just not that many corners available, and you have to go sign him.
Mm-hmm.
The only way to address this is to go draft a cornerback next year. If they have the 18th pick in the draft, it would be nice to go draft an elite cornerback prospect, but it's tough to do that. The Niners don't seem to value it that way. So we'll see what happens. But I personally think they will miss Jason Verrett a ton. I thought he was playing at a really high level. And on a side note, I just feel really bad for him because I thought if he made it through the season healthy, he would get his payday and a long-term contract, which he totally deserves. But
yeah, I mean, the only guy who this offseason I know was kind of rumored to maybe be able to be traded for was Gilmore, and now he's injured. And then for whatever reason, maybe this is just me just looking too far into it, but J.C. Jackson of the Patriots as well. They only tendered him with a second rounder, which is really surprising. And I know he had some struggles at the end of last year with Stephon Diggs, but he still had a ton of interceptions. And I think as a number two is fantastic for the Patriots. So,
he would be the number one on the 49ers by far.
He's the number one on probably 10 teams or at least
again.
Yeah.
Which brings us all the way a full 180 back to the point that there are very few very good corners in the NFL. There are very few good corner tandems in the NFL. There's very few teams with a very good single corner in the NFL, which is why drafting corners is very important. Which now segues us to a team that does believe drafting corners is very important.